Good morning, I'm Ed Buckbee. This is March the 14th. This is another in the series of the oil space history interviews, and we're fortunate today to have Jack Lee, a longtime member of the spaceflight team in Huntsville, Alabama. Jack, welcome.
Good to be here.
I want to ask you a question on what got you in this business to begin with?
A little by accident. I had worked in the University of Alabama. Between my freshman and sophomore year, I was a student trainee at the Naval Missile Test Center out in Point Mugu, California, as a summer student. Then, between my junior and senior year, I worked at the Hayes International in Birmingham. They did mostly inspection and repair as necessary work, not really future kind of stuff. But my roommate had worked at the Redstone Arsenal one summer, and he said, "These guys are really doing some fun stuff up there." It was the Von Braun team. And he said, and after I graduated, he said, "I'm going up to fill out an application." He was going to fill out an application. He said, "Why don't you just go with me and kind of see what they're doing?" I didn't think too much about going to work as a civil servant. I hadn't necessarily heard bad things about civil service, but that really wasn't what I thought about. But once I got here, then I saw what they were doing. This was 1958. And so I also filled out an application, and they, when I graduated in January of '58, and they hired me. That was I came on board 3 days after they had launched the Explorer. So there was a lot of excitement here at that time. So that even when I got here, I didn't plan to stay. I planned to maybe be here for a while. I kind of wanted to be a NAVCAD pilot, and I was thinking seriously about.
And you are a pilot.
I'm a pilot, not a NAVCAD.
Right.
So, but that's how I got into it. Once I got here, then I never considered ever changing.
Yeah.
The 38 years I worked for the Army Ballistic Missile Agency for those 2 years, and then the following years with NASA, I can't remember any 2 days in a row that I ever thought seriously about ever leaving.
You were born in Alabama.
I was born in Wedowee, Alabama. It's in Randolph County, very small town, kind of an underdeveloped county, if you will. Good people there, but they don't have a railroad. They don't have an airport. They have a feeder bus line, but they don't have any debt. By the way, Wedowee is the county seat of Randolph County, but for transportation, you better have your own horse and wagon or a car or truck now.
Did you ever expect that you would get in the rocket business when you were growing up, going to school and so forth?
Not really. We didn't. There was nothing taught in my high school years about space. The first time I really got exposed to it, I took an astronomy course at the University of Alabama, and then in '57, that was my last semester there. In '57, they launched Sputnik, and of course. The physics professors and I was in aeronautical engineering. The professors attempted to start getting involved. They didn't understand much about space. No courses were taught other than astronomy courses. So that kind of stimulated me, and I guess it probably helped me in deciding to come here. But no, when I grew up, we didn't. There was only stars and meteorites. Space.
So you start off in the Army.
I started in the Army.
And you heard about the Von Braun team. I guess that transfer took place during your time frame, where the bulk of the guys and gals from the Army Ballistic Missile Agency moved over to the newly formed NASA Marshall Space Flight Center.
At that time, the Von Braun team had nine directorates. They were called the Development Operations Division. I was working in the one, probably the least famous of the groups, called Launching and Handling. Hans Huter was the director of that.
Hans Huter, yes.
When we became part of NASA, that was in 1958. When we became part of NASA in 1960, then we transferred the Jupiter missile program to the Air Force. And in fact, my last year in Launching and Handling was training Air Force troops to be able to deploy. The Army never deployed the Jupiter missile, but the Air Force did. So at the time, then the Kennedy Space Center was also envisioned. They didn't require any mobile launchers anymore because it was all going to be, fixed launch assets. So the launching and handling division, if you will, the part of them became part of the Kennedy Space Center from a facility standpoint. And then Hans Shooter was given the responsibility for managing a light and medium vehicles program office. And one of those light and medium vehicles was a Centaur. And I went with him on that program. And in 1960, we were transferred completely from the Army to NASA. Really, the nucleus of the Von Braun team formed the nucleus of the Marshall Spaceflight. So you're familiar with that. They had to build legal and procurement, that sort of thing. But the technical nucleus of the Marshall Center was the Von Braun team.
When did you first become aware that the Marshall team would be the first group of people to man-rate a rocket?
It was probably in the 1960s. Now, in 1958, they were talking about even before we became part of NASA. There was this guy who wasn't involved in it, but I've read there were discussions about becoming men in space for peaceful uses. So I guess it was probably in 1960 or 61. When it was, the Centaur program was under Marshall, but it was being managed by an Air Force group. And I was in residence in California, in General Dynamics. And I first recognized that the focus of the Marshall team was going to be around developing heavy lift vehicles and the manned program. Is when they gave up the Centaur. They decided, it was a decision made that was going to be an unmanned vehicle. It was transferred to the Lewis Research Center. And that was the first inkling I got that the focus of the Marshall Center was going to be around using the Saturn I, the Saturn 1B, and the Saturn V that's where the emphasis was at that time.
So when were you first involved in a manned program, either the rocket or a payload? When did you first get into that part of the business?
I was in the after I left the Centaur program, I had worked for Lewis for a while before they transferred. I came back to Marshall in 1962, but I was in residence up in Maryland, a little program called a micrometeoroid satellite protection. And so this is kind of remote, but the purpose of that was to help either verify or not necessarily disprove, but to put some credence to the Whipple theory about the micrometeoroid population. The purpose for that, of course, was to be able to have some idea about how to design systems for man in space. So that's the first kind of key, but it was very indirect. My first real involvement was after the Pegasus program. We launched 3 of those on the 7, 8, 9, and 10 of the Saturn I launch vehicle. Lee James, who was the director of the Saturn program office in Marshall, he also had the satellite, this detection satellite was under him. He convinced me that for my career and for him and for the good of the country, I should go down to the Cape and represent him during the lunar program. I first objected because I remember telling him I really don't know anything about launch operations. Even though on the Pegasus program we were short of people, so I was a resident manager in Maryland, but we took our whole team and our consoles to the Cape, and then I was the test conductor for those three launches. So that gave him an idea. Maybe I should spend some time in operations. So I did. I represented him as a resident manager there until 1969. And after we had the lunar landing, then he chose to bring me back to Huntsville.
So you saw a lot of moonshots.
I was there for the 5 years of the man program, lunar program.
What was the first project that you became a director of at the Marshall Center? When you actually at the Marshall Center, what first program?
That I was totally responsible for as a manager was the Space Lab.
Space Lab. Let's talk about Space Lab. That, as I recall, that was the first time that you and the center became involved in an international cooperative effort, and you had a big role in that Space Lab program.
At that time, and I don't know whether the center still does it, we had a thing called phase project planning. By the way, Rocco Petrone was the center director at the time. I was Bill Lucas's assistant, who was the deputy director, but I had worked with Petrone very closely at the Cape during the Apollo days. And he said that he encouraged me to get out of the assistant business and into to get. I would say he said that you need to get responsible for something.
Right.
Back in those days, we had a thing called phase project planning. We did establish a small team in our program development organization, and we established this as a sortie can task team, I believe was it.
Right.
And the purpose of this was to come up with something that we could put in the back of the shuttle that could be used as a manned laboratory. It was pretty simple and straightforward when we first started. It was, it really was simple. We were just going to put a can back there and not much in it, maybe some lights and heat. But as we progressed into studying that, it became more obvious it could be a good laboratory. And so we called it the sortie lab, sortie can to sortie lab. I was the task team manager of that. I had a small group of people, very, very good way to do business. I had the opportunity we didn't worry about grade structure. You had an opportunity to get the best people you could get, no matter what their grade were, to work on. We had a very small, compact little group. Then, at that time, the European, this was after the Nixon and Agnew study that said we need to build a reusable shuttle, and we need to do more international cooperation. At the time I got into this, it was intended for the Europeans to develop what was then referred to as a tug. It was an upper stage to go into the shuttle. Through a lot of discussion and concern about national security, it was decided by the DOD that wasn't a good idea to have some foreign country building at that time, by the way, the Air Force and DOD was heavily involved in the shuttle. It was not a good idea for some foreign entity or country to be responsible for such a stage. So they had to renege on that deal. Then that put NASA and the country in the business of to maintain relationships and to meet the intent of the international cooperation. They said, well, what about, why don't we give them the sortie lab?
Right.
And the Europeans objected to that initially because they really wanted to get into the launch vehicle, the launcher business. Well, through a lot of negotiation, we agreed that through a memorandum of understanding, which was almost like a treaty in 1973, we agreed through the State Department and the ESA, European Space Agency, that they would pay for the development of the Space Lab, and if it met our requirements and the cost was reasonable, and this is how easy you can do things back in those days, and the cost was reasonable, we would procure an additional Space Lab. So that put us in the position of having not control over exactly how it's to be designed. We were not allowed to give them our specifications and standards and so forth. They had to develop their own, but we had to have an oversight responsibility like any contractor, even though we didn't refer to them as a contractor. We had to have an oversight responsibility to ensure that they were meeting their commitment. And so when that was agreed to, we changed the name from sortie can or sortie lab to Space Lab. Sortie in French means exit, and they didn't want that on their lab. So they, in French, by the way, were taking pretty much a big lead in this thing. So that is kind of how we got into that, and we then made a sortie, a Space Lab program office at Marshall, and kind of like a level 2 responsibility. Headquarters still had level 1, and then I was made the manager of that.
Right. Mr. Lee hasn't mentioned the fact that he became a director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in the late 80s. And has a reputation of bringing good young people into the program and giving them an opportunity to perform. And you became the head of the Marshall Space Flight Center. In fact, I believe you were the director about as long as many of our previous directors. I don't recall the length of time, but as a director, tell me a little bit about how that project, that job was as director. You followed Von Braun, you followed Patrone. It was a major accomplishment for you to be that.
Von Braun, of course, he had a different kind of challenge. He had to build an organization. He had to build hardware.
Right.
For the first time, he had to deal with the Congress and funding, and so the NASA's kind of was set where they were going at the time. We pretty well knew how the congressional committees were going to go. We knew pretty much how our funding was going to be. We didn't have any national objectives, so therefore it was we weren't going to be graced with a large budget.
Right.
So I want to say it was like a maintenance, but one thing that had changed for NASA and for Marshall Space Flight Center was that during the Von Braun days, we had one mission, that was developing launch vehicles.
Right.
Well, after the Apollo, then we had to diversify, and that got us into other programs, mostly in the science programs. The two big ones, of course, was the Space Telescope and the AXSAT. And Space Lab, at the time I became center director, was pretty much operational.
Right.
We were faced with attempting to do as good as we could with the programs that are ongoing, plus try to focus on where we need to go for the future and how we're going to sell the public. And so it was a different kind of activity.
Didn't have a JFK giving us national missions of going to the moon in those days.
And we had our problems with. I was center director when we had the spherical aberration on the lens of the Hubble.
Right.
That was caused us some activities we didn't really plan to have to go through legal.
But you fixed it.
Yeah, we fixed it. The AXSAF was a little different based on the Hubble problems. The Congress forced us into verifying that that we had the technology to build the lens before they would ever approve the program. Right. That thing revolved around us building an X-ray test facility, AXSAF facility, which is out of Marshall now, probably the only one in the world. But we were forced into building that thing in a hurry and getting the mirrors in and verifying. And we were down. We were down to almost the end of the fiscal year where we were going to get approval to put the money in. I think it was the summer before that we finally verified that. But it's a different center, a different NASA. At the time I was center director.
Well, what do you remember as being the one event that you're most proud of during the time you were center director?
I was say probably the. Let me see. That's kind of difficult.
Well, one of the things you have a good reputation for is mentoring young engineers and young men and women to better fit the skills and the jobs and putting together a team more responsive to the mission. And diversification, too, was a big thing in your world.
Yeah, I enjoyed that, and I have to admit that I probably didn't do enough of it based on the situation today.
Sure.
With the brain drain and the experience that's needed at the Marshall Space Flight Center today.
Right.
It's gone.
I understand.
Out of the system. I would say probably, and this doesn't have to do specifically with the program. I was there during the Challenger.
Sure.
I was the deputy director at the time of the Challenger.
Right.
And that was not a good situation. The agency wasn't a good situation. Fortunately for me, I was at Harvard the winter before it happened, and then Beggs, who was administrator, got indicted on some potential wrongdoings. He later cleared for it. And we had a guy named Bill Graham, who came in who didn't understand the Congress. So our center got in. Our agency got pretty much a little bit in disarray. And fortunately, after all the committees and the reviews and the changes, we survived. What I guess I would think would be we're more institutional than technical.
Sure.
Is helping recover Marshall. Marshall was not in good stead at all.
Right.
We were having morale problems. We were during the process of investigation. I was the interim center director at that time, and it's been our policy to when you have a commission like the Rogers Commission, that they did the press kind of releases. Now they had some very sharp and very outspoken individuals, and they were going to the press. We, based on our training, we were reluctant to do that. So I had not done much releasing to the press.
Sure.
I found that the families of the Marshall Space Flight Center people who were working, 7 days a week, from the time of the accident until April, I believe. Some people never took a day off.
Right.
But their families got to be concerned. What they were reading in the paper wasn't good. And their spouses were off working.
Right.
What I think, and this, by the way, it's done. I'll give me credit. When J.R. Thompson came in, he had a different attitude about that, and we worked hard to be able to get not necessarily change public opinion, but to get Marshall doing what it needed to do to get back to where we thought it should be.
Sure.
And after I became center director in 1989, J.R. became deputy administrator.
Right.
I continued a lot of the stuff that
you guys made a good team.
Oh yeah.
Looking at the new direction for NASA today, I know you're familiar with Marshall's job, new responsibilities to prepare the crew exploration vehicle, launch vehicle. How do you see that scheme of things as it relates to your day of manned flight, human flight?
Well, they've got different problems, and they've got real problems. And it starts with a limited budget. It also it starts at a time of a limited budget where you've got to complete the shuttle and you've got to complete the space station, and then you're going to try to get prepared to go back to the moon. Now, the preparation for back to the moon is the thing I think it bothers me the most. When we did the Apollo Saturn program in-house, we had a capability that came from Pinamundi, really. The old Arsenal concept of build the first...
Build in-house, test it first before you turn over the contract.
That's right. And that does not exist at Marshall right now. However, their role is to do in-house design, and there'll be some building of hardware, and not only in the building of the upper stage, but also the old system engineer. So what they're missing is the foundation that we had in the form of procedures and processes and experience at this sort of thing. Got some very sharp technical people at Marshall, no question about that. But what they're missing is the depth and past experience. And so they've got to overcome that. They've got to get the system set and themselves in a position to do the thing, and then they've got to go do it. And I see there's a problem for them right now, much different and quite honestly more difficult than that. Now you can say, well, you can always depend on the contractor. No reflection on the contractor. Where the space business goes, if you don't not have a continuing support to the industrial base, the aerospace industry for space business is also declining. So now where do you turn? You've got to build that base. Now I commend Griffin for attempting, he's kind of using the Apollo model, for attempting to do that, but it's going to take some really hard work on the part of the management of the Marshall Space Flight Center in particular to be able to get positioned to do that.
You know, when you look back on human space flight, and you count up the number of people and companies who have had any involvement with human spaceflight, that's a small community in this country.
It sure is.
And in fact, one of the things I think that you are involved with today is mentoring and helping Marshall Space Flight Center, find those skilled people and help them, remind them how things were done back in the Saturn Apollo days, and maybe they can learn from that.
Yeah, we have we have to do a little consulting, but we have a group of what we call graybeards.
Right.
And they all have the same interests I do in being able to pass on these experiences, and they're all high on NASA and the country and the Marshall Space Flight Center in particular, and they're willing to come out of retirement, if you will, and support that effort.
Yeah, that speaks well of your efforts to lead that. I think that helps the younger generation understand some of the hurdles that we had to clear and what worked for us in those days. Anything you'd like to add to our thoughts here today in your career?
Well, no, other than the fact that it's been a tremendous career. I mentioned earlier, I don't remember any 2 days where I was dissatisfied enough to ever consider leaving. And they paid me for this too. I don't know of anybody that could. I'm sure there are people, but who had the opportunity to start back with the Von Braun group and get business, understand them, and also work with the industry and the community and the Congress. So it's been a really good career for me.
Well, it's wonderful to have Jack Lee, who followed in the footsteps of Warner Von Braun, and one of the human spaceflight guys that became the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center and continues today to work in behalf of NASA and the nation and leading us into space and hopefully back to the moon and on to Mars. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.